All right. So I think you can, I think like this, if you can, if that works.
Wait just a few minutes. I sat down to so that. Is it on? Is it on? Okay. We're going to get started with our work session for Monday, May the 6th. Thank you all for coming out. I think it might be good. I know we've got some guests. Scott's going to kick this off about our transportation master plan. But I think it would be just kind of good to go around and introduce ourselves so that the folks that are here to present kind of recognize or know who's kind of in the room. So we want to start back there and just...
Ken Bennett, Windsor Town Board.
Jerry Wasserman, Finance Commission.
Lori Hall, Shady Commission.
Victor Miller, Planning Commission. Dave Sandlin, volunteer on the Parks and Rec Advisory Board.
Nick Mass, Parks, Rec, and Culture.
Paul Redmeyer, Town Board.
From in the planning department.
Mitch McNeil, Parks and Rec Advisory Board.
Okay, and let's start way in the back there.
Sorry, Wade Willis, Parks and Open Space Manager, Open Space and Trails Manager.
And birthday boys.
And birthday.
Eric Lucas, Director of Parks Rec and Culture.
Ian McCarter, Town Attorney.
Cindy Sharman, Planning Commission.
Shane Hale, Town Manager.
Tom Jones, Town Board.
Barry Wilson, Town Board. Miles Baker, Town Board.
Chris Brown with Farron Piers, we're one of the consultants in the TP.
Carly Smith, also Frank Pierce.
David.
I'm ready.
Oh, good to meet you, Mr. Reddy.
David Soslowski, Town Board, SIS, LOW, that's the
Okay.
Hi, I'm Carlos Fernandez. I'm a transportation planner and I'm a consultant on the team. I'm with a company called FTH Transportation Group.
And I'm Christy Melendez, Mayor, and I'm going to turn this over to Scott Volstead, who's going to lead us into this discussion.
All right, thank you, Mayor. So just, we've all got the introductions out of the way. Just a real quick ground rule, I guess, if we have a question or a comment or anything, we need to speak into this microphone, and we'll have the consulting team speak into this microphone. I'll try and get it around to everybody, so that way the people that are watching at home or streaming or watching on Channel 8 can hear the conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to Carly and Chris and Carlos, the consulting team working on our transportation master plan. So.
Great. Thanks a lot, Scott.
So if you can use that mic, I'll use this one to try and get it around to everybody.
Great. And then slide changer is just...
Oh, yeah. You can either use that mic this afternoon or the keyboards.
Great. Thank you all for being here tonight. We greatly appreciate your presence and are excited to share what we've been up to so far with the Transportation Master Plan, and most importantly, get your input as we move forward and come up with draft recommendations and a vision for your first Transportation Master Plan. So very excited to be here. We'll be talking for about the next 25 minutes and then open it up for questions, and then have about another 20 minutes or so of interactive presentations. So hope to be up here for about an hour and respect your time, but definitely want to make this a dialogue and are excited to hear your questions and to provide answers, hopefully, to them and get some input. So our agenda for tonight, we've already done introductions, so can move on to our second agenda item of project background. Talking about what are the purpose and goals of the TMP as your community grows, and how are we shaping the transportation network in the short and the long term. Looking at some existing condition summaries. So we've been digging into the data on your existing network, multimodal network, some safety data, as well as demographic growth trends and land use data. So we'll share some highlights from that with you. And then identifying early wins and the importance of getting things on the ground early, getting into the 2020 budget and how we can begin to implement as well as plan for the future. And then Carlos will present a financial snapshot, so a summary of the 2019 budget, a breakdown, and understand where the money's going, and then looking forward how we want to continue to break that down moving forward into the future. We'll look at some big data opportunities that we're moving forward with, how we'll be collecting travel time information and the value that will offer the community and the town to be able to track travel time over time. We'll look at a project schedule and go over some logistics with the outreach over the next year and how we'll be bringing community input as a part of this process. And then lastly, some next steps. So introductions, we already introduced ourselves. from Farron Piers, Chris and I, and then Carlos here from Fox Tuttle Hernandez, or FTH Group. So a little bit on the project background. So the purpose of this transportation master plan is one of the outcomes, one of the most important outcomes will be to develop a layered network. So the Complete Streets guidelines that you've already come up with, which is to ensure that streets are multimodal, they're safe for biking and walking, and they're also efficient and convenient for vehicles, is a really great starting point. So we're going to develop a network for each mode. So your 2017 roadway improvement plan was important in establishing a network for vehicles to ensure that corridors are prioritized for vehicles, and we're identifying street classifications. So we want to build off of that and look at the regional transit plan that's being developed and the 3 or 4 stops that are within Windsor and how we can make sure we're providing access to transit. We'll identify a bicycle network that looks at a low-stress, connected set of facilities for bicyclists, including trails and on-street facilities. And then lastly, a pedestrian network. So making sure that there are safe and continuous sets of sidewalks as well as crossings. And so it's really important that we look at each of those networks on top of each other. So not every street is meant to support every mode. There's often trade-offs as we have limited right-of-way. We need to see streets that are prioritized for vehicles and where we can prioritize bicyclists. And that might be parallel to Main Street, or streets kind of parallel to the arterials or vehicular priority corridors. So we call this the layered network approach to ensure that no matter what mode you want to take, you have the option to travel to your destination safely without any gaps. Oops. Lastly, we want to build off the roadway improvement plan that was done a few years ago. So we'll consider this plan as a part of the process, but make sure to look back on it, and as we make recommendations for biking and walking, that we're making any changes that are necessary to the roadway improvement plan to ensure that that plan is consistent with this effort. So the photo on the right shows an analysis of comfort for biking and walking in the areas that are higher stress. So this is for Lone Tree, an example we did, and so moving forward, the analysis we'll do for Windsor will be similar to identify gaps in biking and walking. We'll develop a vision for the long term, which is a fun exercise that we'll do together later to see, when you close your eyes, what does transportation look like in Windsor in 2040? But at the same time, we'll also identify short-term implementation recommendations so we can begin to get paint on the ground and get facilities implemented. Chris will cover some existing conditions highlights too.
Gotta get the right height here. Okay, so for existing conditions, I'm just going to run through a few slides providing some background, and this data and information I'm sure many of you are already aware of, but the intent of this is to just provide us like a baseline of information so we can support our recommendations both quantitatively through the data as well as qualitatively through our public outreach. So first off, we have the population of Windsor. So Windsor's been growing exponentially, as you can see with the line graph. So very quickly growing city, also very quickly growing the number of jobs. And as you can see with the circle graph of population and jobs, Windsor actually has quite a substantial job base. There's a large industrial complex off in the eastern part of the town. So there's a number of people that are traveling external to Windsor to access jobs, but there are also people coming in on a daily basis to work, play, enjoy Windsor, access services, things of that nature. And so, as Carly mentioned, we're wanting to build off all the great planning efforts. We understand that the roadway improvement plan completed a few years ago, along with some other corresponding plans that are going on right now. And so we want to incorporate all of this great information, and then, as Carly mentioned, have an all-encompassing plan that provides the layered network approach as well as understands all of the intricate pieces that go into the transportation network. So we're going to go rapid fire through some maps here really quickly, but first off, key destinations. So this is kind of a first cut. We're obviously very open to hearing from the public how they view their town and what other key destinations there may be. But our first cut includes schools, parks, obviously the historic core and downtown of Windsor, attracting a lot of local businesses and individuals to that area. And so overlaying that with the trail network and trailheads to understand kind of the existing connectivity to these local destinations. And then next is the existing land use. So this is just breaking up Windsor into the residential areas of Windsor, which are yellow and orange, the industrial areas of Windsor, which are in purple, and then some of those commercial corridors or employment areas that are in red and pink. So we're trying to understand, with this map, like the local areas that people want to work, to play, to live. How do those interconnect through walking, biking, driving? How are people going to get to and from these areas and destinations? And then next is the environment slide. So we have the floodplain kind of running through Windsor, corresponding with the Poudre River. And the environment is kind of something that both provides natural barrier, so the river, kind of some of the topographic differences that river creates. And so we're trying to understand, to provide, especially for walking and biking, those facilities that can attract people of all ages and all abilities. So you don't want to be walking uphill for a mile necessarily, or maybe you want to cross this gap to get east, west, or north, south throughout the town. And so this kind of provides us a snapshot into where are those natural barriers and what are the facilities that we could propose to bridge those. And then the next couple slides are drawing off of FHU's roadway improvement plan. So the first is the street classifications. So we have the existing and the future street classifications, the arterial network, the collector network. You can kind of see the major roadways in red. And the red highlight also illustrates roadways for widening, as identified by FHU, while the orange illustrates those urban classification streets, which, just a quick reminder or refresher, that just means that the roads have curb and gutter, sidewalks, potentially bike lanes if they're identified, and not just a shoulder as a rural street would have. And this is using FHU's existing and future volumes. And so the future volumes were drawn to 2040 using a quantitative growth factor that FHU developed for the roadway improvement plan. So the light blue circles illustrate the existing volumes, and they're all in ranges. So the largest circle illustrates the highest volume. And then the dark blue circles illustrate the future projected volumes. And so depending upon the size of the blue circle, you can start to kind of tease out the corridors that are projected to get the most vehicular growth. Understanding that obviously as technology advances and other modes become more available, this is a snapshot, and we're definitely going to consider the vehicular component of this, but also understanding that there's trade-offs and other opportunities for other modes on some of these streets. That came from the FHU roadway improvement study as well. I believe it would have been 2015 data, 2017 data. Wasn't 2017. Yes. Yep. So the data came straight from the FHU study. It's based on the growth. Or Carlos, you said it eloquently before. So.
So hi, I'm Carlos Hernandez. So the current data that was 2017 data was taken on counts. So they did a series of counts to understand what was currently there. And then an organization called the North Front Range MPO has a forecast for the region. So the North Front Range MPO has a model that forecasts future traffic throughout the region. So they used that model to understand growth trends, and they applied it to the current volumes to get those 2040 numbers that you see in there. To answer?
But I assume it's really a function of population, because you never figure out.
Good question.
Cars.
Yeah, the growth factors are based on jobs and population. So they set these zones all over town, and they say how much will grow in this zone, and then the model runs an algorithm and establishes the connections and traffic between those. So but it's driven by population and employment. Yeah.
This came up today when staff met as well, and I think Carlos indicated, like, the model is just a model. Certainly we shouldn't read too much into the tea leaves with this thing, because is that being generous? I mean, there's just, as we forecast out, there's so many factors in this model that could be wrong. I think it's just one data set we can look at when we look at holistically at all the other information.
Great point. Question in the back. I'll go over here so they can hear it.
Yeah, along the same lines, I have a question.
On the same lines, I had a question about the key destinations and projected volumes. Does it take in, is there any way to try and anticipate retail, commercial centers, and industrial development?
Yeah. So are you saying as that relates to the future growth projections for volumes? How the
Regarding commercial centers,
Yep.
like Brands East, and industrial work, or Great Western Industrial Park on the east side of town.
Yep.
I mean, I understand we don't know what's going to exactly happen there, but is there any way that you factored those in?
Yeah. Can you go to the transportation map? The model, the forecast that's done for the region assumes that land use is going to change in certain areas. And what they ask town staff to submit what the changing areas are going to be, the MPO does. And then the MPO says, okay, tell us your best estimate in 10, 20 years from now where the changes are going to occur. And then they generate that map with where the traffic happens. So the estimates for land use changes are reflected in those volumes as a product of the model. However, if I could tell you that that model was correct, I would be working on Wall Street and not standing here tonight, right? Because transportation is so dynamic in what's happening. Like, think to yourself 20 years ago if you thought you could even get a ride by picking up your phone and calling somebody, right? And so now, I'm gonna stand here so no one gets a sore neck. These models are really robust. Like, what's coming in the future is more robust than we've ever had any time in our lives. So to think that 50,000 vehicles are gonna be in a certain place 20 years from now is really hard to forecast. So we have the models, they're a tool. They're tied to funding, like it or not, so we still use them and work with them. But the accuracy of them has a lot to be desired.
Yeah, and the numbers are static. So I mean, the projections, they're not living, breathing projections. They're static projections and a snapshot in time. So we're using data that doesn't necessarily reflect what's actually going to be built out there tomorrow or 10 years from now. It's our best shot in the dark. So yeah, that's where the information came from the roadway improvement plan. And so then we also wanted to just identify the existing network. So we have up here the bicycle facilities, in dark blue, the existing trail network. Windsor has a really impressive, it's over 40 miles of trails, mostly hard surface concrete, some soft surface with the Great Western, but a really impressive backbone network with the Poudre River Trail and a lot of already existing great connections. There's about 4.5 miles of painted bikeways as well as some on-street shoulders, providing some bicycle connectivity across the city. So you can kind of tell it's mostly centered in the historic core, but there are some shoulders on the local county roads. And then the pedestrian facilities, once again, Windsor has a very complete sidewalk network for the most part. There are some small gaps, but otherwise, very complete sidewalk network. Already have a great number of enhanced crossings with the rectangular rapid flashing beacons, so those neon signs where you push the button and the amber lights start to flash. That's a really great tool to use for a low-stress crossing on a busy roadway. There's also a couple grade separated crossings with the Poudre River Trail, so there's already some great bones, some great infrastructure that Windsor has promoted for pedestrians and bicyclists. And then Safe Routes to School. So this data came from the Safe Routes to School survey last fall. And as you can see with the graphs up there, the question was the percent of parents who said the following were the concerns as to why they didn't allow their child to walk or bike to school. So almost half of parents cited, unsurprisingly, traffic speeds or traffic volumes or perceived gaps in unsafe crossings. So this is one component that we can really consider and hammer home on, is considering these gaps for children, which also obviously affect the broader community, and identifying that low-hanging fruit as opportunities to kind of stitch together the multimodal network for all community members, as well as the children that want to access their school perhaps via walking and biking. And finally, regional transit. Next year, there'll be some stops in Windsor connecting to Greeley via transit, which is really exciting. And it offers a great opportunity for people to provide other opportunities to access Greeley via other modes. We also understand the first last mile, which is an important consideration with transit stations, is how do you get to that station from your home via driving, via walking, via bicycling. And so that's another really important thing that we'll look into, is within this network, how does that first last mile connection get facilitated to and from the transit stations? And then Carlos will talk more about safety.
Those of you that have packets, we moved some of the slides around just to flow. They're all in there. You'll find them. But if you're getting a little confused in the layout, we're not trying to do that. We're just, we thought this may flow a little different. So, but they're all in there. Okay, so I'm going to talk about safety. And in this case, safety means traffic crashes. The source of this data set, the traffic crash database, is from the Colorado State Patrol, the database that they offer. These only reflect crashes that were reported, where an officer responds, so it's not everything. And just the other caveat of this data set is it largely underrepresents bicycle and pedestrian crashes because they typically don't get reported. The severe ones do, but a lot of the near misses or slight injury, no one goes to the hospital, don't get reported. So what's going on in Windsor? Well, 2013 is on the left side, and 2017 is on the right side. And if you look at the entire bar, so if you take the orange and the gray together, you'll see a trend where you went from about 220 crashes in 2013 all the way to above 300 crashes. So your crashes are going up, but your traffic's also increasing, right? So both of those are increasing together. So we do this thing called a crash rate. It's not very hard. If you're in 4th grade, even my son in 6th grade can do this. You take the crashes and the volume, you divide it, and you come up with a rate. So here's the good news. Your crash rate is not increasing. That's the great news. So although you've added more traffic and you've added crashes, you've done that equally. That's the good news. The bad news is that every crash that happens is an opportunity for someone to get severely injured or killed. And that's serious. Cars are becoming safer, which is great, but we're becoming more distracted based on CDOT data. So it's important that this data set gets digested in kind of like a TMP context. Question?
Well, I say the other great news is that we have a low fatality rate. Like most of our crashes in Windsor, like maybe one fatality a year, which, you know, is still horrible for that family and all the responders. But, you know, our higher crash rate has not yet corresponded to more fatalities. So that's just probably, you know, safer cars, people in Windsor can, you know, are driving nicer, safer vehicles.
Yeah, so the fatalities, you've kept it consistent at about one a year, which is heartbreaking and is something we want to try to work to zero, but that number, fatalities, has been consistent. So the number to kind of talk away in your minds of this is, in Windsor there are about 300 crashes in a year, okay? And so then where do those crashes occur? The darker the color, the higher number of crashes. So this is all crashes, independent of if they're bike or ped or car on car. This is just all of those 300 crashes. Where do they happen? And to no surprise to most in the audience, they happen on roads, arterial roads, higher speed roads, and most of them actually happen at the intersections. So the intersections is where you see a lot of the crashes occurring. And from this map, you all know the town probably better than I do at this point. You know where the traffic volumes get busiest during the peak hours, and those probably correspond to locations where the crashes are happening. So then the fatal crashes are happening in the, locations that are consistent with the other mapping. We talked about it before, one a year. It appears that speed is a factor in those crashes. And then here are the bike ped crashes. So those are a smaller subset of those 300. Most of the 300 crashes are car-on-car, non-fatal crashes. But the bike and ped crashes do occur at the intersections. They occur where these trails or sidewalks interface with the moving traffic, right? So that's probably not all a big surprise to everybody there. All right, so that's the safety piece. So that's data. We can get that, analyze it. We're going to do some more of that. We have a report coming, right, Carly? So when I'm working on TMPs, I think it's really important to talk about finances and talk about snapshot of that. No one in their right mind goes and shops for a house without getting pre-qualified for a loan. Well, most normal people do, but I guess there are some people that don't, and God bless their hearts. But I presume that you're the type of community that wants to get pre-qualified before you come back and we bring you big plans. I presume your constituents and people at home want to know that too. So we're going to do a financial snapshot. Well, we did it. We're going to show it to you tonight. It's a work in progress. Every number in here might not be 100% correct yet, but we're working on it, okay? What this is intended to do is to draw out those questions so that we get it back 100% correct. I have found over 21 years of doing this statement is the most powerful statement that I can probably convey to you. It's the bottom line of whether you're going to do this or not. And so what we want to help you do is budget for it and then respond to your constituents in a meaningful way. Because you want to keep your jobs, and we want to keep our jobs too during this effort. But this is important. So what's going on? Well, around the Front Range, people are starting to do this. They're budgeting for the outcomes that they want. If you've been to Fort Collins, you've heard about this. It's coming to Loveland soon. This is why we're talking about budgeting for outcomes, because the cost of providing government is going up, not because we're adding more and we're getting bigger. Everything just costs more. It costs more to buy the sand, to have the roads passable in the winter. It costs more to buy the gasoline for the trucks that are servicing the system. The cost of doing it is more, and I think the expectations are increasing. So we want to do a budgeting for outcomes process, or at least propose it, because it emphasizes outcomes and performance, not just spending more money or spending less money. It's about performance. So I want you to think about this, and then I'm going to show you some slides at the end that really characterize this. But first, I'm going to throw some data at you, okay? So I went through your 2019 capital improvement budget and your 2019 town budget. And I worked with your staff to understand how we could break this down to fit into transportation. So this is not just me, this is me working with your staff to figure this out. So you have a public service budget, and that public services budget is to maintain infrastructure, to make sure the town is safe for everybody moving around. So that budget's $10 million in 2019, and to our best analysis of that, about $8.5 million of the 10 is spent on transportation. It's invested in the transportation system to maintain it. So you're using, if you do the math at home, anywhere from 84 to 85%, depending on rounding. You're spending about $8.5 million on operations. You also have, in transportation, we're talking about people moving around, we have to talk about the trail system. And so your trails budget is $1.2 million of an $8.8 million budget for park and rec and culture, okay? So staff reminded me this afternoon that you have a big, I think it's like $1 million or so trail project that's going on this year, right? So this is not every year, but this year you can see that that 13% that lives up there is the trails budget of that. So you are spending some money out of your park and rec budget on transportation as it relates to trails. So then what about new projects, the capital projects, right? Well, you have $34.7 million in your capital budget, and we think you're spending about $14 million of that on transportation, okay? So you can see the other parts, police and services, sewer, fleet, parks and culture, water, right? So you're spending about $14 million of that 34.7 on transportation. I live in Louisville, just as a peer community. Maybe you don't think Louisville is a peer community. I do, but if you don't, that's cool. You can take my money in the parking lot afterwards and send me home. But Louisville is a peer community, spending about $10 million in their budget this year. And so their budget's about $25 million total, and they're spending about 10 on transportation, just as a context for these numbers, right? So that's capital. And then this one's fun. So you take all those costs and you divide them by residents, and you get the cost per resident of providing transportation. Now, this is building new transportation and maintaining what you have, okay? So that comes out to about $700 per resident. When you look at that little digger on the left, she's digging there, that's $275 per resident is spent on operations, so plowing roads, sweeping roads, striping roads, all that maintenance that happens, that's $275 per resident. And you have about $420 per resident in new facilities that you're building. So it's $700 per resident. When you do that on a daily basis, it actually kind of interesting. Comes out to about $2 per day per resident is what you spend on transportation. Someone reminded me earlier that a Starbucks latte is now, I think, over $2. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's over $2, right? Netflix every month is well over $2. So even Budweiser now is over $2, believe it or not. So there are a lot of things that cost more than $2 a day that people consume. And so, but in this notion, $700 a year is where it comes out. What's interesting about Windsor that is compared to your peer communities is you have a lot of different funding sources. So you're going to a lot of places to fund that transportation budget. And there's a list of just some of those that are included in the capital improvement plan. It's clearly not everything, but you are getting funding sources from a lot of different places. So you're like a lot of local governments who have funding challenges in Gallagher and other things. You're going to a lot of places, and your staff are working hard to get those grants. I have 2 more slides on this. This is not intended to tell you you must do budgeting for outcomes. This is if I looked through your budget for a budgeting for outcomes perspective. So you apply to this North Front Range MPO, the people we were talking about who control this model, they also control the money. So gas taxes get sent back to these MPOs, and they dole it out to people, communities who apply, right? So your gas taxes get refunded through the MPO, so you apply for grants to get that money back. When I went through the projects that you have in 2019, 2020, and 2021, you've asked for that money back. About 66% of the money you've asked for back is for automobile projects. About 27% of the money you asked back for is for walking. And then about 7% of the money is going to be allocated to bicycling projects. So that's, if you were saying, hey, we want to get 66% of our population driving, 27% walking, and 7% bicycling, and we're going to do that, we're going to budget to see if that can happen. Well, the new money that you're getting back from your gas taxes, that's the allocation. So then I said, okay, well, what about the money in your current budget? So that money that we were just talking about that's in the capital improvement plan and the operations for 2019, this is money you've already talked about last fall and you've allocated. You have about 78% of it that's going to auto projects, 11% in walking, and 11% on bicycling projects. And so this is one way to look through a lens of how are we spending our current money and how are we going to spend money that's coming our way. And I'm going to come back with the microphone so it can get into the recording system.
When you talk, when you talk about these percentages, does it make any sort of adjustment for the cost of these type of projects? For example, adding 1 mile lane of roadway costs a lot more than adding 1 mile of trail or 1 mile of pedestrian access. So does this adjust for that when it factors the budget at all?
It's the actual cost of the projects. So that 78% is the actual money, in this case, that you're spending on that facility. It's not even an estimate. It's actually how you're going to write checks to contractors to build it or maintain it. And so I'll give you an example of one. There was a project where you were going to build a signalized intersection, and you changed direction and you went to a roundabout in lieu of a signalized intersection. When that was a signalized intersection project, 100% of that was for cars. When you went to the roundabout project, now there was places in there for pedestrians to cross, for bikes to get in and through. And so in that example, that one has more bike and ped improvements in it, not just automobile, but it is the actual cost, not the forecast. Does that answer the question? It doesn't seem like it does, so let me ask me again, because I want to get it right.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering, when you talk about priorities, if you look at this, it makes it look like the priority is very heavily automobiles. But when you actually look at the costs of doing the same level of work, if you said we want to add 5 miles of bike trails, we want to add 5 miles of pedestrian route, and 5 miles of roadway, those costs are going to be significantly different. So I guess that was my question.
Yes, so let me say it this way. A roundabout project could be $2 million, but for that same $2 million, you might be able to build 5-6 miles of trail. So 2 miles of trail, 2 miles of trail, right? A mile and a half, maybe a mile. Can I get a mile? So agree, the infrastructure projects that involve automobiles cost a lot more sometimes, most of the times, than the walk and bike projects do. Until you get into these conversations about underpasses and overpasses for trails. Then now we're starting to get into comparable costs.
I think it's just important to add that there's no value statement to this. There's no, we're not saying, well, geez, why are we doing this? This is just a statement of fact. This is where the money's going right now. And so this may be, based on our transportation needs, this may be the right number. It's just, it's not, it's not assigning any kind of value. I think it's just saying this is really where our money is going this year. So.
We can talk more. We should talk more about that too in the Q&A. We're going to get through big data, and then we're going to open it up, if that's okay.
Yeah, one more section, and then we'll have more time for questions. So big data is another opportunity to look at the transportation system currently and to be able to track it over time. So part of what the Transportation Master Plan is also doing is providing you all with the data set and the kit that you need so that you can see how have we done so far. Let's look back and reflect what's worked, what hasn't worked. So with that, you need to be collecting data continuously and consistently. So we've taken this opportunity to say, what technology is there now that will provide a really reliable and pretty cost-effective way to look at how people currently travel. And so INRIX is a travel time data resource that uses data from our phones. So anytime you have an app on your phone that's collecting location-based data, it grabs that and it's able to measure every minute. It takes snippets of how long does it take us to travel along a corridor between X and Y extents. And so we're in the process now through the TMP of purchasing 1 month of data for October 2018 and plan to, for every year, look at how does that data compare over time. With that, we have some examples of other communities and what they've done with travel time. So a little different than you guys. This is in Southern California where they care about peak last call travel time. Not as much a Windsor problem, but peak travel time, more in the 5 p.m. range, is something that is concerning to people. So how can we have the conversations with the public when they perceive travel time to be very high, and that might just be during a peak time, and so we can see how that changes throughout the day. Can also see in other communities, we've compared it, what is the travel time in a car versus travel time on transit. And then here in Fort Collins, the example on the left, we've looked at how has travel time changed from 2011 to 2015. And we can see that the average along these 6 different corridors, the travel time is actually the same minutes per mile. So that's that perception that it's getting longer and longer to travel along a certain roadway can be kind of confirmed or dispelled with data resources, and lots of opportunities for infographics and to be able to have conversations with the community with this data source. So with that, I know we've been talking at you for a long time. Wanted to see if there were any questions on what we've presented so far. We do have about 20 more minutes, a bit of an interactive exercise, but wanted to take a little break.
You said you.
Now, if you really feel important, you said that you, being the little brother of Louisville, the slide about Parks and Rec and how much they go back to where it was there. Is that normal for a community the size of Louisville? Do you know how that compares? So we always give our Parks and Rec guy a hard time, so I just wanted to know. At the trails 1.2 as a portion of the total budgeted amount, if that compares to Louisville.
I don't know off the top of my head. It's on my computer, and I'm going to look because I don't want to make up the answer, but I will look at that and get you the answer in a couple of minutes. Okay. Other questions, or they could be comments too. Oh, yep, sure.
Thank you. You had mentioned INRIX, and you said you purchased a month of data. I guess, do they do specific, can they target specifically Windsor traffic? And can you buy or do you subscribe to it? And if so, how much, I guess?
Yeah, so the subscription is for by month. So we've gone forward with purchasing 1 month of data for the whole town of Windsor, and then we can analyze the data by picking certain corridors and certain extents and certain times of day. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. It certainly can target Windsor.
Yep, oh yeah, we're targeting just the town of Windsor is the data that we've purchased. Collected through cell phone data, so kind of big data of those traveling within town. So even if you don't live in Windsor, it can see once you cross into town boundaries, it pings and can check your travel time along a certain corridor, and we can play with the data in really cool ways and set different gates and extents, so pick the corridors and the areas that we want to look at. And so if you're doing a certain project on a corridor, you can see what was the travel time before we added a right turn lane, added a bike lane, and what was the travel time after. And it's a really good way to track the success of your projects.
Is that all mobile carriers?
They don't reveal. For privacy and confidentiality, they don't reveal which carriers, but the data is massive. It's millions and millions of pings of data. They just don't say whether it's AT&T or whoever it is for privacy reasons.
Other comments or questions?
I had asked what the cost was. Is it,
It's
5-month subscription?
it's 1 month at a time, and it's $2,500 for 1 month of data.
Okay, any other questions or comments before we move ahead? One back here? Are we good? Okay, we're going to keep going in the interest of time.
So next, we have an interactive data where we're going to be talking a little bit about the vision and goals for the Transportation Master Plan. So you can see on the right is the vision for the comprehensive plan for the transportation section. So all planning efforts come up with a vision statement, which is that what is the long-term vision? What does the town look like? What is transportation like in Windsor? So you can see just the verbiage for the comprehensive plan. They talk in Windsor in the 2040 version, and comprehensive plan emphasizes the multimodality, connectivity, as Windsor expands, that the street grid in these new neighborhoods is to be connected, safety, convenience. So part of this effort and a little bit of the value of this exercise is to see what is the vision, what are the most important values for you for Windsor for the future of transportation. So we have a fun exercise to do so, where probably the only meeting where you'll be asked to take out your phone, your cell phones, and start a text message on your phones. And I'll walk you through this. It might seem a little bit weird, but it'll all come together. So when you start your text message, in the address where you would normally put the phone number or the contact, write 22333. Oh, yeah. Yeah, if you're at home, you can also do this, and your input will come up as well. That would be pretty cool to get additional data. So does everyone have that so far? Yes. Yeah, this is really a scheme to Venmo me. And then in the message data, in the message, write my name, Carly Seif, 120. And this will just enter you into the polling game.
Send it.
You sent it? Did you get a message that you have?
Just asking.
Okay. So, yeah, and then push send. Sorry, that's what you're asking. Okay. So once you've pushed send, you've entered the polling. And now in that same conversation, I want you to write the one word that most describes your vision for transportation in Windsor. And if you need help, Chris can go around and help you. And we'll start to see words pop up, and it's going to populate what's called a word cloud. And so the words that get put in multiple times will get bigger, and then words that are just in one time, you can see will be the same size.
So everybody's 3 words, do 1 word at a time. And if it's like 2 words, like easygoing or whatever, you want to hyphenate it, or it's going to show up?
Yeah, then easy will pop up and going will pop up. Especially don't do any negatives, so no bikes. Instead, bikes will pop up, which is, I think, not what you want. So you can see efficient has been pulled multiple times. Connectivity's popping up. This is looking cool. Thanks, guys. Great. A lot of common themes. Connectivity being a big one. Efficiency, that's a new one from, what's that?
I got a text that said the poll has received the maximum amount.
Okay, maybe that means it's time to evaluate, / I need to buy a subscription to pollingeverywhere.com. Instead, I'll just put a plug in.
Put in trails. I'll put in 2, but I put in trails.
Thanks, guys. This is pretty cool, and hopefully this conveys the themes that you're imagining, and we're seeing a lot of consistency. So connectivity is a big one. Trails and kind of bridging those together, connected set of trails. Efficiency, which multiple modes. I think that would apply to. A connected network is one that's convenient and efficient for users. And then some of the smaller words, we've got walking, human-powered, innovation, which is great. Does anyone want to speak to connectivity, or any other of the smaller themes that came out? Expand on what you see when you see a connected system, who that refers to. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, so two of my options were actually connected and trails. I might be biased because I'm on the Parks, Rec, and Culture Board, but I know one of the challenges that has faced my family in particular is trying to kind of map out our route. If we wanted to explore riding our bikes from our house to a business or a destination, trying to figure out how we're going to go about that, especially with our young children. So for me personally, trails and connectivity is a big deal.
Yeah, that's great. And we've talked with Wade about kind of intuitiveness of making sure when folks see a map that they can get to their destination and that they know that's a low-stress facility, and that's important to establish as well.
I also had trails and connections. To me, the connectivity piece, like where I live, we have a beautiful trail, the Poudre River Trail, but you can't get across the river to get to the grocery store, for example. So it's a great trail, but not necessarily connected. And so that's where I think we could do a little bit better in our transportation plan. The same token, we have folks that live kind of by the grocery store that are just on the other side of the river, but can't get to that trail easily without getting in their car, driving to a trailhead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that speaks to trails being used a lot for recreation currently, but there's maybe a latent demand for trails and bicycle and pedestrian network to be used for transportation, but really having to get that to connect all the way to the destination rather than just something that you drive to and use for recreation only.
I was just going to say too really quick, we've also heard recreating versus access to services, and we actually heard from staff and now as well as citizens here the importance of the grocery store access, for example, and that's something we can consider in our key destinations for sure.
I also said connectivity, but I like the one under there that says connections, multimodal. I mean, part of my vision would be that as a resident here, I could choose any one of 4 means of getting someplace. I could walk, I could bike, I could take transit, or I could use an automobile. I also like what you all said, that each roadway doesn't necessarily have all 4 of those ways. So I think in our planning, trying to go back to key destinations, where are people going to be going? Where does it make sense for us to try to make those connections?
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, thanks, guys. These common themes are going to be really important and helpful as we begin to put together a vision statement and kind of come back to you with that vision statement as part of the TMP.
Just, I looked up the data, the question you asked about. So the Louisville Open Space and Trails budget's $2 million this year, and our estimate is that you're at $2.9 million. So you're $900,000 more than the Louisville budget this year.
So we're waiting, hold on,
wait, let's get this in the record, hold on.
Yeah, let's do get this in the record.
And we're 10,000 more people that we're serving.
There you go. Yeah, so per capita, 10,000 more. So about $1 million more in Louisville with about 10,000 more people here is the storyline for this year.
Great. Thanks, guys. So project schedule, just so you can see where we've been and where we're going and when you can expect to see us next. So we'll be wrapping up the plan in March of 2020. So be here for a while, hope you like us. And you can see we're wrapping up existing conditions now. We'll be delivering a draft or a final in late May, a draft in mid-May, and then moving on to task 3, which is recommendations. And then within recommendations, you can see we'll be back to town board in early August, late July, when we'll be talking about 2020 budgeting and having that conversation about high priorities. And then pulling together other recommendations that maybe aren't for next year, but moving into the 3-5 year, and then long-term recommendations. Prioritization, so going back to the community, we'll talk a little bit about public outreach next, and helping get input for what projects are most important, what do we want to do first as funding becomes available. And then lastly, our last task in March of next year will be to put together a final plan and implementation roadmap that you can use as a guide to help you with implementation moving forward. Yeah. Sorry, you're getting your steps in today.
Looking at your schedule here, what can we anticipate, town board, what kind of information as we get into our budget cycle for 2020?
That's a great question. So the outreach, the first stage of outreach will be happening primarily in June. And then we're behind the scenes, Fox Tuttle and Farron Piers are going to be focusing on what have we heard from the community, from the existing conditions process, from you all, from staff, and what can we pull as first project, kind of high priority recommendation projects, and come to you all with those recommendations as you start to put together the budget, and it's kind of synthesize what we've heard with that list, the short list.
And so Ken, our deadline then is basically end of July is what we've asked these folks for, is to give us a list by the end of July. So so again, this is going to be a preliminary list. It's not going to be all inclusive. It's just going to be some things that we think we can implement in 2020 that kind of get to the community's vision and where we're trying to go. And so when we have our capital meeting with the town board in August, staff will be able to present all those to the board at that point.
Okay, along those same lines, is this going to incorporate the CDOT project of rerouting 392 and 257?
Yes, that's one of the plans they have highlighted. So I think one of the earliest slides had different plans that are going to incorporate. So it had our comp plan, it had our transportation study, it has this. So
too far away.
All of these things help to inform the community.
And one other question on budget, appreciating that we don't have a perfect crystal ball. We don't know for sure 10, 20 years down the road, but will we be able to maybe next year or the year after get into like a 5-year projection, a 5-year budgeting plan for transportation or something of that nature?
So I just want to show you an example of what we're going to deliver that answers that. Not that one. Sorry. Let me go back. Can you go to the Fort Collins? Keep going up. Go. That one right there. And then can you zoom in? Just don't go to full slide, just zoom in. Yeah. So this is something, ooh, it's not gonna let you do that. All right, you can go full. We're gonna do an incremental. You might have to do a full slide, full screen. We're gonna play with the tech here for a minute. Okay, so this is in my wheelhouse, and this is what I'm envisioning, and we can craft this as a team with the community, but it's going to be in 4-year chunks. There's 2015 to 2020 is the green, 2021 to 2026 is the blue, and 2027, 2030 is the brown. So there's like 3 chunks, and then what are in those boxes are design and input, and then there's capital funding, and then operations funding. So any project that we bring forward, we're not only going to say, hey, where should we go get the money to get the project built? We're also going to say, how much is it going to cost to maintain it and deal with it once we have it? So we're not going to give you a Ferrari and say, good luck trying to maintain it. It's like when you're on a game show and you win one of those like really high-powered vehicles, and then you get home, you're like, how am I going to maintain this thing? We can't do this to you. We can't do that to anybody, particularly you. We like you, so we don't want to do that. So we're going to come up with these incremental steps. But for this one that's coming in July, what we talked about this afternoon with staff was that we try to find things that fit within the current budget that you have. Like you have a striping and a maintenance and a repaving program. Remember that money I talked about, the $8.5 million operation? A lot of times to get bike lanes or crosswalks in can be done as part of that program, but what we find is that the apprehension to doing that lives within the neighborhoods or the community, where they're saying, I'm not sure I want the bike lane on this street, or you're going to take away this piece of it, so we can't do that. So it's usually not a funding challenge. It's usually kind of an outreach and help me with a noun. Communications, there we go. And so what we're going to try to do with some of those quick wins is not say, hey, we should reallocate $1 million of the $8.5 million to do this. What we're going to do is do some things that fit within the budget to get those moving ahead that are identified in June. But that's not going to look detailed like that. That's what you're going to get next year. Does that get it at it? I get a thumbs up. Okay.
Just to pick up on what Ken said, because we've all had this conversation, and the large trucks on Main Street have always been an issue. We can identify that as a problem that we'd like to solve, but the solution clearly requires, one, a lot of money, but the cooperation of CDOT and probably Walden County. I'm wondering if, as you identify problem areas or proposed projects, can we identify who all needs to buy into those projects, because that may change the timing and the priority.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things we talked about with staff this afternoon is when we have some pretty good draft plans ready to go in the first quarter of next year, we want to sit down with CDOT and talk with them about which one of these are ones that raise a red flag for you that it'll take years to do. And then what are some of these that we can get going with you as quick wins right away? So before we come into here and finalize that, we're going to coordinate with CDOT on that, so we don't propose something that has a 3-year process, or 10-year process for that matter. So yes. Fair enough. So we'll add, that's a good point. Both of those to the list. Other comments? Yeah, let me go back here. I just want to do the microphone so that people at home can hear what's going on.
You talked about existing key destinations. Are you looking towards future key destinations as well? New schools being built?
Yeah, definitely. So this is just an existing conditions assessment at this time, but we've received future parks and that conversation about where the focus is. Foci changing, future parks being an example, new neighborhood developments. So that's a big piece as the community's growing. Where are those nodes shifting? So at this point, it was kind of what's the data for existing conditions, but as we move forward, recommendations will look at where do we see those future demand needs and make sure we're providing access to those.
Right, and I'd just add that Wade Willis actually suggested today that maybe we let the community also identify other key destinations. So we may say, geez, it's a school and the grocery store, and people may say, no, it's High Hops and, you know, the fairgrounds or whatever. So I think it's good to make sure the community says, no, this is actually our key destinations. This is where we want to go. So we're you know, checking back in with them, because again, I think that's a big thing with the TMP that I want to keep in front of this is really the community's plan. You know, we've had the engineers look at it. We know our roads. We drive them every day. But we know that we don't have near enough money to address everything. You know, when you go to that slide with all the big circles, you know, like pick 3 circles. That's our 20-year plan, right? These things are really expensive. So I think this is about really making sure our community has weighed in and said, yes, you know, Fairgrounds Boulevard is a big deal to us, and County Road 13 is not, or, you know, whatever. And I just said that because I know Barry cares about 13. But, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great point, is we can do an existing conditions data analysis until we're blue in the face, and I think sometimes we do. But what's most important is hearing how the community wants to travel. So maybe it's not getting picked up by cell phone data ping, but what's the latent demand, or how do people feel while they travel? That doesn't come through when we're behind the screen looking at our data software. So that perception and those feelings and latent demand are all important parts of the public outreach process.
So just to make the final plug for this, so this map, if you have it in front of you or have it at home, or you want to download the plan, is forecasting some intersections that have like 40, 50,000 vehicles a day. A lot of those, where you see the darker purple really coming out, those are significantly congested, high-volume intersections. You don't have the money. CDOT doesn't have the money. The Federal Highway Administration, FHWA, doesn't have the money to build all that. No one has the money to make that an uncongested network. And I won't go on record as how much of that is going to cost. I'm thinking that as part of this, we should just calculate how much it would cost to have double lefts and through lanes and all the things that we envision at all those, but you can't afford that. So part of this TMP is coming to terms with the fact of how much traffic is going to be in certain places within a reasonable projection, and then saying what are the priorities for spending for the next 15 years or so of how we're going to interface with that. I like to go get OPM, I call it, other people's money. It's really our money back, but it's going and getting our money back and bringing it here so that 80% of this can be funded with OPM. But even if we did that, you can't build that. So I think that that's I said I characterized it earlier as a really fun conversation to have because that allows the community, which we'll talk about in you, to get creative on what transportation future looks like, right? So that's a little bit of the wet blanket. We'll pull it off in a minute and get you excited again, but that's a little bit of the reality. Other questions from the comments? Okay, I think we just have a few more slides, right, Carly? Yeah. Cool.
So there's been a lot of anticipation and foreshadowing to the outreach approach component of things. So when Farron Piers and Fox Tuttle Hernandez submitted on this project, we knew that public outreach and hearing from the community was really important to Windsor. However, we wanted to make sure that was done in efficient ways and in the most meaningful way possible, not just Tuesday evening, whoever can make it. Sorry if you can't. Well, hopefully you like what we do. We wanted to make sure we're going to where people are and that we're effectively and meaningfully engaging with community members that maybe can't attend a public meeting or don't really understand the process behind transportation. We also want to hear from employees, those who come to Windsor to play. So it's not just people who live in Windsor. So we proposed this kind of a la carte sushi menu approach to community outreach and gave a budget of $28,000 and worked with Scott and with town staff to identify what are the best ways that we can work with the community. So we've gone through and identified about half the budget's worth of outreach approaches, and this includes a traditional open house that will be on June 11th, an Intercept event, which is where we go to the public, which will be the first summer concert series on June 6th. So these are also subtle plugs for our outreach events. We'll also be giving an Intercept toolkit to town staff. So if you want to go in front of the grocery store, go to Eastman Park soccer games, staff can bring that toolkit to the community in a number of different ways as kind of summer calendars start to pan out. We'll also be providing social media material to go on the website, social media approaches like Facebook and Twitter. So we've separated outreach into two different phases. So the first is happening now, and that's to get feedback on the existing conditions. We call it sometimes a listening session of tell us how you travel. What are the most challenging parts of your bike ride, of your drive commute? How do you feel when you're walking across 392? What are some of the things that we're not seeing in the data? And this is going to help us inform our August 2020 CIP, inform the longer term list of recommendations. So that's phase one. Phase two, we go back with a very draft set of recommendations, ask for feedback, any tweaking, honing of those recommendations, and also prioritization of those. Here's our long list. Which is the most important to you? And we've done this through money voting exercises. You can see in the bottom right picture, everyone gets Windsor dollars and really exemplifies there's limited funding. How do you want to spend it? So everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too, but it really kind of, we create interactive exercises so that we can accurately show the limited resources that we're working with and get feedback from folks that can then be incorporated into the plan in a meaningful way. So next steps made kind of reference to these already, but wrapping up existing conditions at the end of this month, and then 2 public outreach events on the calendar for June 6th and 11th, and we're working to put others on the calendar as well. And then moving forward, recommendations will be back in July or early August, end of July, to discuss 2020 budget. But these are kind of the imminent next steps. And if there's any other questions, we're happy to answer them, or going back to any previous slides, if you'd like us to dig deeper, we definitely can do so. No questions. Got them all out.
Can we show them a couple quick win projects?
Yeah, sure. So we have some pocket slides if there were time. So we've been talking a lot about kind of early implementation 2020 budget. So we like just previous projects we've worked on as consultants. Sometimes we don't get to see the implementation, so it's really fun to follow up with communities we've worked in. So this is a snapshot from an email from Frisco when we worked on their trails plan a few years ago of all of the dedicated funding they had already received from CDOT, underpasses that they were building, new trails, and this was all just 1 year after the plan, things that they were getting on the ground, which is really exciting to see. And that energy and the momentum from the outreach was there and continued past the adoption of the plan to implementation. In Eagle County, we just wrapped up a first last mile plan, which, as Chris mentioned in the context of regional transit, is bridging that gap between one's house and the bus stop, or the bus stop and your place of work. So getting to and from the bus stop can often be the barrier to taking transit, and in Eagle County, where it is very rural, that's one of the main kind of drivers of Eco-Transit, which is the Eagle County Transit Agency's ridership, is they need people to get to the bus stop. Once they're there, it's a great service. So before the project was even complete, this was about 6 months after a meeting like this, after the kickoff meeting, where we implemented a pilot project to get folks from the bus stop, which you can see is on the right, that little orange bus, to a hospital where a lot of low-income patients had appointments regularly. So that's a mile gap. That's actually uphill and under a highway, and it is actually often snowing, so that is a challenging walk to make. And so we provided a free transit service using Ride Taxi. So it's called a public-private partnership where Eco-Transit paid a fixed rate to Ride Taxi for that service. But we got that off the ground during the process of the project. So that was a fun one to see the benefits early on.
So left is before, right is after. This is an OPM project, Other People's Money project. So 20% of it came from town funding, 80% of it came from external sources. This was 3 blocks from a school. Turns out that I don't know, anywhere from 8 to 12, 13-year-olds, you tell them the route, but sometimes they forget and they need some reminder along the way. It also turns out that 40 and 50-year-olds can't remind themselves to slow down in school zones, believe it or not. And so this was a project that I spoke of earlier, where it was a repaving exercise and used existing budget. And this largely was a result of the neighborhood saying, yes, you can finally do this. This project, it's Shields Street in Fort Collins. Shields just west of College Avenue. And so, wider sidewalks. There's a crossing here that I get installed, one of those flashing crossings. And then there are ground markings along the entire route from neighborhoods to the school. And then what's interesting about this is that the neighborhood, which it was two lanes in each direction, a center turn lane. The center turn lane came out, and there's 2 lanes now, and that was kind of an issue 3 years. But during this process, neighborhood came together and said, we understand that this will help people slow down because there's tighter travel lanes, there's more friction, and gosh, if we really mean we want to be safer with kids, why don't we start in our neighborhood? So this was a project that was not a multi-year budget project. This was a project that was done largely with local dollars with their current revenue. Right? And so this is the kind of examples where we're saying we're not going to probably be asking for $300,000-$400,000 projects. These are like $50,000, $60,000 projects.
Great. Well, that's all we had. Really appreciate your input and your time tonight. We'll be here if you have any questions that come to mind later, but we're excited to see you in the coming months and work with you over the next year. Thanks, guys.
Yes, I like.